Hey everyone, James from Flying Guillotine. Today going to be doing my first sort of list where I'm going to be ranking the 6 Gialli that Lucio Fulci directed. Lucio Fulci, of course, along with Argento, one of the masters of Italian horror. And I think these films are quite interesting to look at because they're not necessarily the absolute most popular Fulci films, but many of them sort of occupy that sort of second tier. And for me personally, I would put the top 3 at least of this list really up against anything that Fulci did in his career, including the Gates of Hell trilogy and Zombie, which is probably most well known for. And I think they're really interesting contrasts to those films too, because they are very different. There is a segment of people who really have, I don't know, Fulci has been described as a hack before. And if you think about the films that people are first going to watch when they they Google Lucio Fulci's name, they're going to probably end up on Zombie and The Beyond and City of the Living Dead. And I really, really like those films, but they are films that tend to focus on certain aspects like really strong images and atmosphere and things like that over plot. And so I can sort of understand the perspective of people that get to Fulci and they're seeing these films and they're like, this guy has no idea what a story is or something like that. But if those people would then go ahead and watch some of the Giallo films, especially I think his better ones, no spoilers, I guess, for the later part of this episode, I think they would really find that he definitely can tell a story when he wants to. And those films are just trying to do something else. Whereas the Giallo films will, a lot of them have at least a stronger structural narrative to it. So this list is going to be a very personal list. It's definitely my own ranking of the 6 Gialli, and also subject to change to some extent. I do like all 6 of these films. And there's one in particular that I probably rank fairly differently from kind of the consensus of the Fulci fans, which I would definitely consider myself of. Another interesting thing is that he's very different from Dario Argento. Argento really kind of, in my view at least, sort of went down this path of being... he could certainly do logical Giallo, notably like the Animal trilogy, Deep Red, and maybe Tenebrae. But as he went on, and especially his more supernatural films, I think he also tended to prioritize really, really strong images. And also his films, especially something like Phenomena, which has some great scenes, but also has a lot of bloat to it too. So I think compared to Argento, Fulci's narratives oftentimes tend to be a little tighter and stronger. Most of these films are in that 90 to 105 minute range at the longest, most of them even more towards 90. So there's less of that indulgentness that sometimes comes with sort of the great success. And I mean, Argento is one of my favorite directors, absolutely. But you know, he had a lot more money and resources going towards his films than someone like good old Fulci. Another interesting thing, couple last interesting points. A lot of these films actually don't have like a strong central primary protagonist, which I when I was looking back at sort of Fulci's films, I found that quite interesting. Notably, Don't Torture Duckling, which really bounces around between different characters, and I guess is a little bit more of an ensemble piece. New York Ripper, where I guess you could say the detective and the psychiatrist, but it's a little tenuous. Same thing for Murder Rock. The other 3 do have a little bit more of a stronger, this is the character we're following throughout the film, but I did sort of note that as something worth discussing. And the other thing is these 6 Giallos are spread across quite some time, from 1969 with Perversion Story all the way to 1984 with Murder Rock. So that really covers quite the span of Gialli. You know, if we have our sort of Mount Rushmore of Giallo directors with someone like Sergio Martino there, who did a bunch of Gialli in a really short time. And he did 1 or 2 outside of that period, but he's really, really known for the sort of 5, which only occur in like this sort of almost just a 2-year range. So, and that really was the Giallo's heyday. And so it's interesting to see Giallo Fulci direct Giallo before Bird with Perversion Story all the way till very, very late in that Giallo cycle with Murder Rock and New York Ripper as well. I mean, I would recommend all these films. Fulci also, as a last fact, did a lot of his Giallo work, interestingly, outside of Italy. There are two set in Italy, but even those, especially one of them, has sort of an atypical setting from our sort of Rome set, very urban thriller. Okay, so let's get into the list. So first up, starting from back to the beginning, 6, Perversion Story, also known as One on Top of the Other, 1969. Only 2,200 people have seen this on Letterboxd, and this is notably the first pre-Bird Giallo, and it feels totally different from Giallos that come after Dario Argento. This period was a little more domesticated thriller, psychological drama, so a lot more focus on the psychological aspects, less of the set pieces and the gloves and stuff like that, black gloves with knives. Really interesting film. Interestingly, it's written by him, and it's adapted from the same material that was adopted into Vertigo. Great cast here: John Sorrell, Marissa Mell, both sort of genre favorites, especially John Sorrell. You can see him in a lot of the films just right around this period that are sort of more inspired by these domesticated, diabolique inspired dramas set in San Francisco, just like Vertigo. It's good film. I do tend to prefer sort of the post-Bird ones that have a lot of like stylized black glove killers, stuff like that. I do like a couple of the films from this era. This would definitely be one of them. I think it's definitely one of the better ones. Notably, this is the only film I've only seen once. I saw it about a year and a half ago. And the print also wasn't necessarily the best. I know there's a Blu-ray out there too that might be worth seeking out. But for me, I think this is a solid film. My memory of it is not the strongest, but it's a good sort of thriller, just sort of focused on like John Sorrell and seeing sort of like his psychological hurdles and stuff like that he goes through. Next up would be Murder Rock, which has, surprisingly to me, only been seen by 2,600 people on Letterboxd. It is a late period Giallo, in fact, his last one. In fact, I'd say probably one of his last quite good films. I do like this film a fair amount, and it has... I think this is the only one of Fulci's Giallo that sort of has that classic blood and black lace structure where we got a bunch of people together in sort of a troupe. In this case, it's like a dance troupe, so maybe a small amount of Suspiria inspiration there. And anyone could be the killer amongst that troupe. Everyone's a little bit off, a little bit weird, and it's just sort of a very classical setup for a lot of these Giallo murder mysteries. I think this film has some really, really fantastic style, a lot of lighting techniques going on. There's a ton of strobing. There's a lot of use of colors. For me, this film suffers just a little bit from, I think, a declining budget. Fulci in his golden period, I think his films look really great, and I think a lot of that has to do with budget and having really, really strong technicians here. And he worked with a lot of really good cinematographers of that time period, people like Luigi Cavalier, Sergio Salvati. This film had a less notable, to me, cinematographer. Well, I think it looks great. I think the technical aspects are starting to fall off a little bit. I think the script is also a little bit weaker, and the film really can drag a little bit in that middle section, especially. Notably, he had sort of been coming off this long, sort of very fruitful period, in my opinion, working with Dardano Zacchetti in sort of that Gates of Hell, starting from, I think, The Psychic onwards. So for 5 or 6 years, he was working with him, and I really like a lot of those films in that period. This is a film he did not do with Zacchetti, and I think it just is a little bit slow. I'm not sure exactly what it would have benefited from. It's also an interesting comparison with his previous Gialli, which was just a year or two earlier, a New York Ripper. This film, while it does have its sort of like leery moments where we will maybe put the camera on a woman while dancing and doing some sort of thrusting maneuvers, it's a lot less sleazy and leery than that film too. The Keith Emerson score for me is very hit or miss. There are definitely some moments where I do have quite a good time listening and watching the dance numbers, and there's other moments where I'm like, it's just doesn't necessarily hit in the same way. So for me, definitely one I like, and if dance horror giallo sounds like your jam, then this is definitely a great film for you, and I think it's a good film. For me, this is probably kind of in that 7 out of 10 range, the same as Perversion Story too, where it's an easy hang, especially if you like giallos, but isn't quite on that upper echelon. So probably mid-tier Fulci, good level giallo, but not great. Yeah, and like Ripper, this one pairs a professor and a cop together. It has a couple good sort of like Italian genre stalwarts that I'm a fan of, Claudio Castanelli and Ray Lovelock. But they don't, especially Castanelli, who I think is one of the better Italian genre actors. He doesn't necessarily have a lot to do other than to look really sweaty and suspicious throughout the film. Other than that, it doesn't necessarily give him a ton of great material to work with. And just everything around here is just a little bit weaker. I think Fulci directed the hell of this film. I think Fulci, of all the people involved, is definitely the one that's operating just at peak capacity here. But it's just not quite as good as the next 4 films. Okay, so number 4, I have Lizard in a Woman's Skin. So this has been seen by 8,600 people, so by quite a few more than Murder Rock and Perversion Story. And I think this is the one where I'm ranking this probably lower than most Fulci fans would. And for me, this film is probably the only one that would I say I admire it and I respect the craft of it more than I actually like this film. Florinda Bolkan gives a really, really strong performance in this. She is sort of playing a woman that it sort of follows that gaslighting structure of these giallos set in London here. So again, we have Perversion Story San Francisco, New York, and now London. So still not into the homeland of Italy. And I think I just tend to like these gaslighting giallos a little bit less. From a technical standpoint, this film is really superb. There's some great special effects work done by Carlo Rambaldi that has dogs, and that they actually needed to go to court to prove that they did not harm any animals in there. So that's how good it is that the Italian authorities thought animals were harmed because the special effects were so strong. So, really, really well done in that stuff. And it just leaves me a little bit cold, and I'm not totally sure why. It may just be my preference away from sort of those gaslighting ones. It's also the rare Morricone score that I don't necessarily love. It's not bad, but when the alternate is like a normal Morricone score, some of which are my all-time favorite scores, then I don't necessarily love this one as much. It's sort of in that like discordant tone that was very popular in this time period. Good companion piece with the Martino Giallo, All the Colors of the Dark, which also sort of has this gaslighting plot to it that goes in very different directions, also London set. Okay, so next up, and so these next 3 are really 3 that I'm a big fan of, and for me, I would put these 3 up against the Gates of Hell trilogy and how much you like them. I am a big fan of just the genre in general, so I like a lot of giallos. So if you are someone that is a giallo fan like myself, then maybe you would agree with me. And I just as soon rewatch these as the Gates of Hell. Okay, so first up here, let's go. All right, so number 3, I got The New York Ripper. 15,000 people have seen this on Letterboxd. This was a film-to-film episode with Iñaki, so please do check that out if you're interested in us doing sort of a spoiler-filled deep dive into it. I really, really like this film, and I find this to be weirdly rewatchable, maybe the most rewatchable of these 6. It's definitely one of my favorite Fulcis, and I think a lot of that comes down to me just loving that really grimy, New York setting. It might be my favorite sort of in this era of really grimy New York films, things like Cruising, Taxi Driver, as well as the Charles Bronson Death Wish. Just really, really like that atmosphere of like New York sleaze. I think it works great. There's some like great subway shots where like the subway is just filled with tons of graffiti. It's really what like Joker, the film that came out a few years ago, wishes it had. And back then they just had to film in the subway probably at 3 a.m. in the morning. It has some great gore effects. It's very nasty. This is certainly not a film for everyone. Oddly enough, I find that the killer design is great. I think if someone came to me, they were trying to do a serial killer film and like, what if we had a killer quack like a duck? I'd be like, that is a terrible idea. You should not do that. Weirdly, it works in this film really well, and I think it's a big part to the reason that it just sort of cuts into just the nastiness and the sleaziness of the film to make it seem a little bit more lighthearted in a way, and it makes it a little bit harder to take it as seriously as just like a piece of like nastiness in the way that like something like Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, or something like that would. Films that I do respect the hell out of, but I don't necessarily find them to be very rewatchable. This film for me, and maybe it's just because of the quacking, it really is a very, very rewatchable film. I think there's also a lot more going on in it than is usually given credit to, and that's probably just because so much of the violence and the sleaze is at the forefront, but I think the characters are really oddly well thought through. This is written partly by Darzano Sacchetti, who I think brings a little bit of humor, and who wrote a lot of those golden era Fulci films. So a really well put together film and super well made. Everyone has something to hide in this film, and in the end, the killer ends up being, well, I suppose I shouldn't spoil it, but everyone is up to no good in this film, and I just really like it. And the more I think about this film, and the more times I've re-seen it, the more I am a fan. So this is one that has definitely sort of gone up in the rankings for me, and it's almost one that the first time I did it, I was like, I think I really like that, but I almost felt bad for liking it. And now the more I rewatch it, the more I guess I just have no shame. So big fan of New York Ripper. Could easily be higher. Definitely could be as high as 2. And for me, once you get past those like 654 range, these do take a big jump in terms of how much I actually enjoy that. Soundtrack is also top notch, sort of like this jazzy New Yorkie type thing. Yeah, just really great. Lots of use of good techniques, pans in and out, gore effects. All right, next up we have another really good film in my opinion, and this one really went up when I rewatched it. I have seen this film a couple times. There's also a film-to-film episode on this, so check that out if you're interested. And we're finally going to Italy after being in New York twice, San Francisco once, and London. But it's very atypical for a Giallo. It's set in rural Italy, where it's southern and it has a very different look to it. It's very sunlit, a lot of outdoor shots going on, and everything is really, really white. So it creates a totally different atmosphere than sort of the urban mystery that we're used to Argento doing. And to this, of the ones we've talked about, only really, well, I guess the psychic and lizard in a woman's skin sort of fit into that more urban mold to it. And this film is just really, really well done as well. There's a lot of interesting style here. One thing I realized is that Fulci was doing a lot of these cool techniques like split diopter in Perversion Story and Don't Torture Duckling that almost remind you a little bit of what Brian De Palma would really focus on in a lot of his films too. I think this film has just a couple scenes that are just really, really phenomenal. The scene that first comes to mind is the scene where Florinda Bolkan's character is hunted down by a mob, and it just has some great and very sad use of music that reminds me a lot of sort of like the musical cues that Tarantino would do later on, especially in something like Reservoir Dogs. And I think this film also has just a lot to say about society. It was a very controversial film at the time, very critical of the church, and very controversial as a result, just for being very, I I guess they were accusing it of being anti-Catholic. I don't want to spoil the film, but it has a great finale. Who the killer is well done, and the ending is just totally unforgettable. And personally, while some of the gore effects and stuff might be a little bit dated, I really, really like how this film ends. Another great score by Riz Ortolani, who is probably most well known for his Cannibal Holocaust score. A great cast of sort of genre regulars, if you like Thomas Millian, Barbara Boucher, and this one is a bit more of a ensemble piece. It sort of bounces between characters, but oddly, it works pretty well here in this setting. So really like this film. Definitely one of the best Giallos around for sure. Okay, and so number one, I have The Psychic, which is set in Rome, and so probably the most sort of traditional Giallo setting here, seen by 7,000 people, so less than Lizard, less than Duckling, and less than New York Ripper. And I think this film's really interesting. Came out in 1977. I think it has the most sort of deep red vibes of any of Fulci's Giallos, and sort of like this really dark Italian city. And this film was a bomb. And I do wonder if this film had done well, and if Fulci's career would have gone a little bit differently than the path that he went down. His most probably, one of his biggest successes, and I think one that really defined that latter half of his career, was the fact that Zombie in 79 did as well as it did, and that film notably pushes a lot of the excess. Whereas this film is a lot more restrained. So we end up in places like New York Ripper and the Gates of Hell trilogy, as a result of maybe the films that took off in Fulci's career. Whereas if this film had taken off, I wonder if it just would have gone in a totally different direction. Like a lot of Fulci's best films, this one written by Darzano Zecchetti as well. I'm probably the biggest fan of just this story. For me, it's a very engaging story, and it's very sad as well. It has a pretty strong primary protagonist, in my opinion. I know this view is a little bit controversial. I know some people are not fans of Jennifer Neal's performance here, and finding her a little bit wooden and lacking energy. I actually find it to work quite well. This is definitely one I would rank highly. It's The Psychic. So the film sort of follows this woman who has some psychic tendencies and stuff like that, and sees what she thinks is a murder that has happened in the past. And so it deals a lot with just, can you change anything, or can you solve these crimes in the past? And her just struggling with what fate is, and you're left at the end in the question of, like, did she actually do anything in it? So I actually find the story to be extremely engaging, and for me, this is like my favorite Fulci Giallo, and one that I would probably put just beneath the two sort of Argento 1A, 1B classics of Deep Red and Tenebrae. I think this film is great, and it's short. It keeps me engaged throughout. It's got a good cast. You got Gianni Garco as well as Jennifer Neal. The score is also the first time he works with Fabio Frizzi, I believe, who would go on to score a lot of the Gates of Hell trilogy. Technical standpoint, done by Sergio Salvati, who shot Zombie, The Beyond. So in some ways, this is sort of, he's getting introduced to a lot of people that he would work with for the next while, but the story is very, very different, and I feel like if you wanted to convince someone that Fulci is not just about excess and pushing stuff to the limits, I think this film would be good to show. It's very restrained, it's very Hitchcockian, there's a lot of suspense there, and I think you have those Hitchcockian elements too in Murder Rock and New York Ripper, but they are also often can be overshadowed, especially on a first watch, with just like excessive gore, they are just much more extreme, provocative films. Whereas this film is just, I think, really, really good. Has like this really dark look. I love the use of red in here. So for me, absolutely one of my favorite Giallos, and definitely one that might be my favorite Fulci, or at least in that sort of like upper Fulci tier. Okay, well, that concludes this episode of The Flying Guillotine. Let me know how you enjoyed it. If you liked this, might do Sergio Martino's Giallos at some point. I do need to rewatch a couple of those still in order to sort of, get my total ranking of that. But definitely another favorite here on sort of like that Mount Rushmore of Giallo directors. So thank you again for tuning in, and hit that thumbs up button if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you'd like to see more. And I will see you all next time. Cheers.